The land had learned Elias Crow's footsteps long before it learned his name. The slow creak of his boots, moving across dust and scrub like a tired clock counting out another lonely day. His ranch sat far from the last whisper of town, where fences leaned as if exhausted by the wind, and the sun burned the sky into a pale, merciless blue. Elias had come west years ago with a woman whose laughter once filled the house like bird song, and she had died there, too, leaving silence nailed into the walls. Since then he spoke only when the land demanded it, to horses, to cattle, to the ghosts that gathered at dusk. That morning the air felt wrong, heavier than the usual heat, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He rode out to check a broken section of fence near the cottonwood grove. A place the Apache avoided, and the white men feared, for reasons no one spoke aloud. As he drew closer, the wind carried a smell not of sage or dust, but of iron and old sorrow. The cottonwood stood taller than the others, its branches twisted like reaching fingers, and beneath it the ground was scarred with old fire, pits and arrowheads half swallowed by soil. Elias slowed his horse, his heart tightening for no reason he could name, and then he saw her. She hung from a low branch, her small body still, her dark hair tangled by the breeze, toes barely brushing the dirt as if the earth itself refused to let her go. Around her neck hung a rough wooden sign, letters carved deep and angry. "White man, don't forgive." Ellis felt his chest split open, breath leaving him in a sound he didn't recognize. She was a child, no more than 12 by his reckoning. Her face bruised but not yet claimed by death. Her eyes fluttered, lips cracked and dry. And for a terrible moment, he realized she was still alive. The world narrowed to that truth alone, drowning out the cicadas, the wind, the past. He swung down from his horse and ran, hands shaking as he lifted her weight, cutting the rope with his knife. She collapsed into his arms like a broken bird. Light and fragile. And when her chest rose weakly, Elias felt something inside him roar awake after years of silence. He laid her gently on the ground, tearing strips from his shirt to bind the raw skin at her neck, whispering words he hadn't spoken to another human in years. Her breathing was shallow, each breath a small battle, and the sign lay beside her like a curse. Elias stared at it, anger boiling so hot it made his vision blur. He did not know who had done this or why, but he knew enough of the old stories, the bad blood that soaked the soil long before his boots ever touched it. Apache children did not wander alone. Not without reason, not without danger, chasing them like wolves. He lifted her again, cradling her against his chest, and mounted his horse, riding hard back toward the ranch. The ride felt endless, every jolt threatening to steal her breath. But she clung to life with a quiet stubbornness that reminded him of the land itself. At the house he laid her on his bed, the same bed where his wife had died. And for a moment guilt stabbed him sharp and cruel. Then the girl stirred, a faint sound escaping her lips. And guilt was swallowed by purpose. He cleaned her wounds, fed her water drop by drop, watched as color slowly returned to her cheeks. As the sun dipped low, she opened her eyes, dark and sharp even through pain, and stared at him with fear and defiance, braided together. She tried to pull away, whispering words in Apache, calling him something that made his chest ache, even though he didn't understand it. Elias raised his hands, showing he carried no weapon, and spoke softly, telling her she was safe, that he would not hurt her. The words sounded thin, inadequate against centuries of broken promises, but they were all he had. She did not believe him, not fully, but exhaustion dragged her back into sleep. That night, Elias sat by her side with his rifle across his knees, listening to every sound outside, the howl of coyotes, the crack of branches, the distant echo of drums that might have been memory or imagination. He wondered who would come looking for her and whether they would see him as savior or enemy. Near dawn, the girl woke again, stronger this time, and spoke his language in broken fragments learned from traders or stolen moments. She told him her name was Nada, that she had been taken from her people after a skirmish near the river. Accused of a crime she did not understand. The men who tied her to the tree had laughed, carving the sign as a warning, meant not for her, but for him. For all white men who thought forgiveness could erase blood. Elias listened, his jaw tight, each word cutting deeper than the last. He wanted to promise her justice, revenge answers, but the truth was he had none. All he could offer was shelter and the fierce quiet vow forming in his chest. When the sun finally rose, painting the land gold and cruelly beautiful, Elias stepped outside and looked toward the horizon, knowing this act of mercy would not end quietly. Saving the girl meant choosing a side he had avoided his whole life. Reopening wounds the land never truly let heal. Inside, Nita watched him through the doorway, fear slowly giving way to something fragile and dangerous, hope, and as the wind moved through the cottonwoods, carrying whispers of the past, both of them understood that what began beneath a hanging tree would not end until the land itself decided it was finished. The second day began with the sound of hooves that were not his own. Elias woke before the sun. The habit of a man who had learned survival through listening, and the rhythm reached him through the walls, like a warning tapped directly into his bones. He stood still, rifle in hand, breath measured, eyes on the doorway where Nita slept, curled like a wounded animal, her trust still thin as ice. The hooves passed, slow and searching, then faded, leaving behind a silence more dangerous than noise. Elias knew then that word had already begun to move across the land, that what had been done beneath the cottonwood was not meant to remain hidden. When Nita woke, she sat up too fast and winced, fingers brushing the mark at her throat, as if to make sure it was real. She watched him with the careful eyes of someone who had learned that kindness often wore disguises. He gave her food, cornbread, dried meat, setting it down and stepping back, letting her choose. She ate slowly, never breaking eye contact. And when she spoke, it was to ask why he had cut her down when the sign said he would not forgive. The question struck him harder than any bullet. Elias told her he did not believe in signs carved by cruel men, that forgiveness was not something written in wood, but earned in action. She listened without nodding, without agreeing, but something in her posture softened, a barely visible loosening of the shoulders. Outside the land stretched wide and unforgiving, and Delia's realized that keeping her here was no longer an option. If she stayed, men would come, some with ropes, some with guns, some with smiles sharpened into knives. He told her they would have to move, that he would take her to a place where Apache still gathered near the Red Mesa, though it meant crossing territory. Claimed by men who did not ask questions before shooting, Nita's eyes flickered with recognition and fear, and she asked him if he would hand her over like the others. Elias swore he would not, and for the first time she believed him enough to stand. They left before the heat climbed. Elias packing only what could be carried without slowing them down. Nita rode behind him, small hands gripping his coat, a way to remind her with every step of the horse that he was no longer alone. The trail they took was old, barely visible, used once by Apache scouts and later by outlaws who wanted to disappear. As they rode, Ellis felt the past pressing in from all sides, the wars he had avoided by staying small and quiet, the promises broken long before he was born, yet paid for in blood by children like the one behind him. Nita spoke little, but when she did, her words painted pictures of her people, of songs sung at night and stories told by firelight, of a brother who had tried to stop the men who took her and had fallen. Beneath rifle fire, Elias swallowed his grief whole, knowing there was no comfort he could offer that would not ring hollow. Midday brought danger in the form of riders on the ridge. Silhouette sharp against the sky. Elias pulled the horse into a dry wash, covering Nether with his body as shots cracked overhead, dust jumping like living things around them. He fired back only once, enough to warn, not enough to kill. And the riders retreated, laughing, already satisfied by fear. When silence returned, Nita's hands trembled. But her voice was steady when she asked if all white men hunted children. Elias told her no, then hated himself for how weak the answer sounded. He wanted to explain that cruelty was not owned by a single color or tribe, that hate traveled freely between hearts. But the land had taught her otherwise, and words could not rewrite scars. As night fell, they made camp among rocks that still held the day's warmth. Ellis built no fire, trusting the stars to give them enough light. And as they ate, Nita asked him about the woman who had lived in the house by the cottonwoods. He told her of his wife, of laughter turned to silence, of how he had learned to survive by shrinking his world until it could no longer hurt him. Nita listened, her head tilted, and said that among her people grief was spoken aloud, so it would not grow teeth in the dark. The idea settled into him like a challenge. When sleep finally took her, Elias stayed awake, watching the horizon, knowing they were being followed, not just by men on horses, but by something older and heavier, the weight of history, a vengeance waiting for a reason. He understood now that saving Nita was not a single act beneath a tree, but a path he had stepped onto, one that would demand more than silence ever had. And as the stars wheeled overhead, Elias made a promise to the land and to the child breathing softly beside him. Whatever came next, he would not turn away. The land changed as they traveled east. The open plains tightening into broken stone and red earth that rose like old wounds against the sky. Elias felt the shift not just in the ground beneath the horse's hooves, but in Nita herself. She sat straighter now, her gaze scanning the horizon with a familiarity that told him they were nearing places her people still remembered, yet comfort did not come with recognition. On the third morning, they found tracks circling their camp, boot prints mixed with horse marks, careless and deliberate at the same time. Elias studied them in silence, reading the story they told. 3 men, confident, unafraid of being followed. He erased what he could, but he knew it would not be enough. Nita watched him, her face tightening, and said the men who hung her had spoken of a bounty, not in money, but in favor, the kind that bought protection and forgiveness among the wrong people. Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This was no longer about a warning sign on a tree. It was about making an example that would echo. They moved faster after that, riding through the heat, resting only when the horse threatened to give out. By afternoon, they reached a narrow pass where the wind screamed like something alive. And there, blocking the way, stood a small Apache scouting party. Bows were drawn, rifles raised, eyes hard with suspicion. Nita slid from the horse before Elias could stop her, lifting her hands, speaking rapidly in her own tongue. The air trembled with tension as the scouts argued among themselves, eyes flicking to Elias with open hostility. One stepped forward older than the rest, his face carved by years and loss, and asked Elias why he carried an Apache child through a land that hated them both. Elias answered simply that she had been hanging from a tree when he found her, and he could not leave her there. The truth landed like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading through the group. They took Elias's weapons first, hands rough but controlled, then allowed him to sit while they examined Nita's injuries. She stood proud despite the pain, telling them what had happened, naming the men, repeating the words carved into the sign. Anger moved through the scouts like fire through dry grass. But beneath it lay something darker, fear of retaliation, of another cycle beginning before the last one had ended. After long discussion, they decided to escort Elias and Nita to a temporary camp hidden among the mesas. The camp was small. Families gathered close, children quiet, elders watching from the shade with eyes that had seen too much. Elias felt every stare like a verdict waiting to be spoken. That night he was questioned again, his past laid bare piece by piece. He spoke of his wife, his ranch, his refusal to take part in the wars that had scarred the land. Some believed him, some did not. Trust, he learned, was not given freely here. It was measured in blood and time.